Hi, I'm Chris Streliff. Thomas Hills and I are using sentiment analysis, a tool from big data approaches to the psychology of language, to examine emotional affect in the syntactic and semantic variable positive anymore, which has been of interest to American dialectologists since the 1930s. Our findings contribute new knowledge to our understanding of positive anymore by confirming a positive feature of emotional negativity. We also believe more broadly that we reveal sentiment analysis to be a potentially useful tool for researchers working in dialectological and variationist sociolinguistic paradigms. And we also show that microsyntactic and microsemantic features like positive anymore can be studied through sentiment analysis. For researchers interested in experimenting with the methods that we demonstrate, the scripts that we've used to scrape Twitter and to assign sentiment ratings are freely available at this website. The adverb anymore standardly occurs in Englishes as a negative polarity item, meaning that it must be licensed to appear in a clause by an earlier trigger of negative polarity, or more precisely, non-positive polarity. This standard NPI version of anymore is demonstrated by the text of the tweet shown in example 1. Some speakers, however, are also able to use anymore in positive polarity clauses, as demonstrated by the tweet in example 2. Positive anymore has been identified as occurring across large swaths of the United States and Canada, particularly through the methodology of surveys that ask people whether they can say positive anymore or whether people around them use it. It's been particularly associated with areas of major Ulster Irish settlement in the United States, as shown by surveys like the Atlas of North American English, where the red positive anymore isogloss encompasses the U.S. Midland, as well as some stretches farther to the west and into the upper south. A potentially fascinating feature has been posited for positive anymore, that as its syntactic requirement for negative polarity has been relaxed, positive anymore may have adopted a semantic or affective requirement for emotional negativity. Horn has repeatedly described the preference for positive anymore to occur in emotionally negative expressions. In the only empirical study we know of to examine the connection between positive anymore and negative affect, Horn and colleagues at the Yale Grammatical Diversity Project surveyed the acceptability of positive anymore in complaints and non-complaint sentences. They found much higher rates of acceptability for positive anymore when it occurred in a complaint than when it occurred in an expression of a positive concept. This posited feature of negative affect potentially represents a fascinating case of syntactic negativity transferring over to semantic negativity. If that's right, that's interesting not only for our understanding of positive anymore itself, but also potentially for our understanding of how licensing requirements on NPIs can change. However, an important caveat is that these findings have been based almost entirely on consciously elicited evaluations of the acceptability of positive anymore rather than on studies of natural language productions. Studies have relied primarily on consciously elicited evaluations of the acceptability of positive anymore, because positive anymore occurs very infrequently in natural language corpora and in genres like the sociolinguistic interview, and is very difficult to elicit during dialectological surveys. Of course, it's hard to quantify exactly how low frequency something needs to be infrequent. But as an example, during sociolinguistic interviews I conducted in Kansas City that resulted in more than 200,000 vowel segments that could be analyzed phonetically, I collected only a total of 5 instances of positive anymore during casual speech portions of interviews from just 4 interviewees. As a result of that, researchers have needed to rely on asking people whether or not they could use positive anymore and whether people around them used positive anymore. Problematically, though, researchers reporting results from consciously elicited acceptability judgments of positive anymore often also warn us that consciously elicited judgments of positive anymore may not be reliable, because speakers seem to be unable to accurately assess positive anymore as a feature in the speech communities around them, and even as a part of their own grammars. Ironically, Humans suggests that this inaccuracy in self-assessment may be a result of positive anymore's infrequent occurrence. As such, Positive anymore exists in a paradox where, because it occurs infrequently, we've had to draw most of our knowledge about positive anymore from consciously elicited judgments. But also, because of positive anymore's infrequency, those elicited judgments of positive anymore's acceptability may not be reliable. So in the context of the present research, we have a feature of negative affect that we want to explore in positive anymore. But to this point, because positive anymore occurs infrequently in natural language, knowledge of that feature has been based on qualitative analysis in the case of Lebov and Humans' projects, or potentially spurious acceptability judgments in the case of the work by Horn and the Yale Grammatical Diversity Project. Our aim is to find a way to overcome the problem of infrequent occurrence to allow us to study affect in positive anymore through natural language occurrences. Even if we're able to overcome the problem of low frequency, though, examining affect still leaves us with an analytic problem, because determining affect relies on a great deal of contextual knowledge or subjective evaluation. This is exemplified in the 5 utterances of positive anymore that occurred in my Kansas City sociolinguistic interviews. Divorced of context, each of these utterances seems to be a complaint, which would support the hypothesis that positive anymore occurs with emotionally negative expressions. However, in the actual context of the interviews, these were expressed as emotionally neutral or positive statements. As such, it's very likely that if we encountered these productions in a corpus, we would code them incorrectly as affectively negative expressions. So our problem requires 2 solutions. First, we need a way to overcome positive anymore's infrequent occurrence so that we can examine natural language productions. Second, we need a way to objectively code emotion in language so that we can study affect without relying on contextual knowledge or subjective evaluations. For the first of these problems, we turn to Twitter as a solution. We've returned to the corpus I collected for the research reported in Strelov 2019, which included nearly 80,000 tweets with anymore occurring in a clause final position that were tweeted over a 1-month period from within a 75-mile radius of 5 cities in the U.S. Midland: Pittsburgh, Columbus, Ohio, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and Kansas City, and 3 cities representative of other dialect regions in the U.S.: Chicago in the north, San Francisco in the west, and Birmingham, Alabama in the south. To solve the second problem, we turn to sentiment analysis. In sentiment analysis, human raters evaluate words for emotional and psychological characteristics. The ratings that they assign to words can then be applied to the words that occur in a document or other body of language to calculate values for the emotional or psychological characteristics in that piece of language. Sentiment analysis has been widely used and has been shown as an effective way to predict patterns in seasonal mood variation, stock market trends, and national responses to things like celebrity deaths, earthquakes, and economic bailouts. For example, in work reported as Hills et al. 2019, Thomas Hills and colleagues calculated national valence indices for 4 countries using the Google Books corpora for the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, and Italy. Their NVI was highly correlated with the Eurobarometer survey of subjective well-being, showing a high degree of validity for the NVI as a predictor of well-being. When they extended the NVI across the time depth of the Google Books corpora, they found strong correlations between dips in national well-being and national traumatic events such as wars, political upheaval, and economic downturns. We apply 2 complementary sentiment analytic frameworks. Osgood's semantic differential is one of the oldest and most widely used sentiment analysis frameworks. It has a very large set of words with norms established for valence, arousal, and dominance, which have been extensively validated in a number of studies, and allows us to tie into the broader literature of sentiment analysis, including works like Hills et al. 2019. We complement the traditional perspective afforded by Osgood's semantic differential with the newer framework of the valence-aware dictionary for sentiment reasoning. VADER is appealing for our study on 2 points. First, VADER was trained on a Twitter corpus. Second, VADER is polarity sensitive and will flip valence scores in the presence of negative polarity. This, of course, is crucial for a study like ours that hinges on differences in polarity. To assign sentiment ratings, we worked from the 79,000 plus positive anymore tweets originally reported in Strel of 2019. To facilitate analysis, we consolidated the 8 cities reported in that study into 3 dialect regions based on findings reported in Strel of 2019 of inter- and intra-regional variability in positive anymore productions. These were the East Midland, containing Pittsburgh, Columbus, and Indianapolis, and the West Midland, containing Kansas City and St. Louis, as well as a non-Midland, containing Chicago, Birmingham, and San Francisco. To further facilitate analysis, we consolidated the 20 NPI triggers from Strel of 2019 into 6 NPI trigger categories. Crucially, the first 4 of these NPI trigger categories, overt negation, question, semantic negation, and other licensing, are standard NPI licensors. So when any more occurs with any of these triggers, it should be regarded as a case of standard NPI anymore. By contrast, the other 2 triggers, negative affect and unlicensed, are likely to be cases of positive anymore. For our VADER-based analysis, we wrote scripts to assign a valence rating to the words in each tweet and to calculate an overall valence rating for each of the 79,717 tweets. We could then calculate mean valence ratings by dialect region and by NPI trigger. To apply Osgood's semantic differential, our entire corpus was tokenized and lemmatized into a corpus of more than 1 million individual words. These were assigned ratings for valence, arousal, and dominance, and from these ratings, averages could be calculated for the valence, arousal, and dominance of each NPI trigger in each dialect region. If positive anymore is in fact associated with emotional negativity, we would expect that the language that occurs with positive anymore will be more negative than the language that occurs with standard NPI anymore. Quantitatively, in our sentiment ratings, this means that the dimension of valence, which we calculate with both frameworks, VADER and Osgood's semantic differential, the 4 NPI trigger categories that standardly license NPIs should be associated with relatively higher ratings for valence, indicating relatively happier language. The 2 trigger categories that do not normally license NPIs and therefore would tend to be associated with positive anymore should be associated with lower valence ratings, indicating sadder language. Furthermore, because Osgood's semantic differential returns ratings for the emotional dimensions of arousal corresponding to how engaged or detached language is, and dominance corresponding to how agentive or passive language is, we believe we can look for additional emotional insights into positive anymore. Drawing on Lebov, Ash, and Boberg 2006's observation that positive anymore might be associated more with the speech act of complaining in the eastern area of its range, we draw on the idea that complaints represent a highly engaged speech act and a speech act reflecting a high degree of passivity. As such, we would expect positive anymore to be associated with high arousal and low dominance. We present our results as bar charts showing the mixed effects estimated averages for sentiment ratings for each NPI trigger in our entire data set and for each of our 3 dialect regions. Standard NPI triggers are shown in red, positive anymore triggers are shown in blue. We also report a p-value showing the significant score for the difference between the 4 standard NPI trigger categories and the 2 positive anymore triggers. Valence ratings returned by VADER confirm our hypothesis entirely. Through the entire data set and in each of the 3 dialect regions, all 4 standard NPI triggers have higher valence ratings corresponding to happier language than the 2 positive anymore trigger categories. In all 4 views of our data, the differences between standard NPI anymore triggers and positive anymore triggers are highly statistically significant. VADER shows that language that occurs with positive anymore is more negative than language that occurs with standard NPI anymore. Valence scores returned by Osgood's semantic differential tell us exactly the same story. Again, in our entire data set and in each of the 3 dialect regions, standard NPI anymore always has higher valence scores corresponding to happier language, and positive anymore trigger categories always have lower valence scores corresponding to sadder language. Our hypothesis is also generally confirmed for the dimension of arousal, where we associate higher arousal with more engaged language, which we further associate with the speech act of complaints. Across the entire data set, the positive anymore trigger categories are associated with higher arousal scores showing greater engagement, which we take to be indicative of using positive anymore in situations like complaints more frequently than standard NPI anymore is. On this dimension, however, we identify some additional nuance. While the picture seems to be fairly straightforward in the East Midland and even the non-Midland, we see some differentiation in the West Midland, where arousal scores in the NPI trigger context of other licensing are anomalously high. This has an interesting fine-grained correspondence with a finding in Strelith 2019 that trigger categories like adversative, such as "it's hard to do that anymore," may function differently in West Midland cities like Kansas City and St. Louis than it does elsewhere. Finally, our hypothesis is also confirmed for the dimension of dominance, where we associate lower dominance scores with greater passivity, and again take greater passivity to be an indication of complaint. Again, across the data set, we see higher dominance scores showing more agentive language associated with standard NPI anymore, and lower dominance scores associated with passivity connected with positive anymore. Sentiment analysis then strongly confirms the association between positive anymore and negative valence, particularly in the dimension of valence, which is associated with happy versus sad language. We see that the language that occurs with positive anymore is sadder, as indicated by lower valence ratings, than the language which occurs with standard NPI anymore, which is associated with higher valence corresponding to happier language. Crucially, this link holds regardless of the framework we use when we use VADER versus Osgood's semantic differential. Despite these two frameworks taking different approaches to polarity, the context in which language occurs, and being trained on different data sets. Regardless of our framework, the link between positive anymore and lower valence and standard NPI anymore and higher valence holds. We also see confirmation of the association between positive anymore and the speech act of complaint in the higher arousal scores associated with positive anymore and lower dominance scores associated with positive anymore. While sentiment analysis has been applied widely and successfully in many fields that take big data approaches to language, variationist sociolinguistics and dialectology have largely not implemented sentiment analysis as a tool, and we hope that our research suggests that it might be worth including in our collective researcher toolkits. In particular, we note that third-wave approaches to sociolinguistics have acknowledged the role of affect in driving identity practices and establishing iconicity for linguistic variables. As sentiment analysis provides an objective way to measure affect in a language dataset, we suggest that sentiment analysis may be particularly worthwhile and interesting to explore in third-wave variationist sociolinguistic paradigms. We also suggest that our research has useful implications for researchers who do work in sentiment analytic frameworks. Sentiment analysis has tended to take on very big issues and very big data sets and things that are happening in terms of sentiment and affect at a national level. Our researcher shows that sentiment analysis can also reveal interesting and important things at a microscopic level, and that very small variables might be well within the purview of sentiment analysis, and indeed these types of variables that would fall within the realm of microsyntax or microsemantics should very much become the purview of sentiment analysis research.